introduce is Dr. Stephen Schlatter. Dr. Schlatter is a practicing architect, theologian, and author. He currently makes his home in Phoenix, Arizona. He holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Arizona State University and a Master's of Architecture from Bath in the UK, and a doctorate in theology from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Dr. Schlatter is the author of Architecture in Common, which is above me here, as well as many other academic articles relating to architecture and theology. Dr. Schlatter will present on the theme, the architecture of the mystical body. Dr. Schlatter.
Thank you very much. I'm actually not going to present on the architecture of the mystical body. That was a paper, I was asked to submit a writing sample to the presenters, and I submitted a paper, Architecture of the Mystical Body, so that's how this got tagged that way. However, I will talk a very, very little bit about that, very shortly. I've been struggling, like many of you here, with the question of what constitutes a valid Catholic architecture since about 1985, 1983. And thanks to the Rotary Scholarship, I was able to go to the University of Bath to do a master's where I was confronted with the disjuncture of what Vatican II was calling for in terms of architecture, beauty, liturgy particularly, the vision of the church, particularly in Lumen Gentium, and the buildings that we were building in the United States. I felt this disjuncture that architects were not getting it. So what I decided to do for my master's thesis was simply to treat the documents of Vatican II, the relevant pre-conciliar documents, such as Mediator Dei and so forth, and the post-conciliar documents, as a sort of an architectural program to read the vision of the church, to read the documents of the church through the filter of architecture, to suggest what that would mean as an architectural program for architects. So that eventually turned into the book Architecture and Communion, which was also translated into Italian as L'architettura del corpo mistico, the architecture of the mystical body, hence the topic, or the title of this talk. But I want to talk about particularly this idea of a metaphoric architecture. The mystical body, the architecture of the mystical body, there are a lot of relationships going on here. It seems to me that in Scripture we find three great metaphors to describe the ecclesia, the church. And of course, this is a transcendental reality. We as human beings are body and soul. So therefore, we are necessarily symbol-knowing, symbol-using, symbol-making beings. That is how God created us. God, who is entirely transcendent, shows himself and speaks to us through symbols. The three major symbols are, indeed, the body of Christ, the temple of the Holy Spirit, or some sort of temple, tent-dwelling form, and the city. So we have these three metaphors, the temple, the body, the temple, and the city, which resonate through sacred architecture. And indeed, in a lot of ways, they predate Christianity, they predate Judaism. We see the very earliest examples of some sort of religious expression related to the body, and particularly the image of the mother. This is a votive, some sort of fertility votive, probably around 5000 BC for Malta. I'm sure many of you know it. It's called the Fat Lady. I don't know why, but we see the broad hips representing fertility, ample bosom representing the feeding from Mother Earth, and then the head here as the seat of intellect. Now this was found, curiously, at the Hypogeum in Tarshine in Malta, which again, this is an underground earth temple, and again you see that kind of form here that to me suggests a correlation going on at a very, very early stage, a very intuitive understanding of what the body is as a temple, what the temple is as a body, all related to the order of nature. We see another interesting example of this in the work of Schwaller de Lubitsch, where he takes the Temple of Luxor in Karnak and he imposes the body form. And you see these like fascinating relationships going on here. There's a lot of things going on here: axiality, linearity, symmetry, and so forth. But the point is here, the overarching point is that when Jesus then says, "My body is a temple," or, you shall destroy the temple, and in 3 days I will raise it again, he's making this correspondence. And he's making this correspondence because this correspondence seems to be kind of a universal, very, very human understanding. Now, I'm going to, I want to shift here a little bit and talk about why this whole language, this sacred architectural language, has been lost. Basically, what I want to do is give you some ammunition here. I'm sure many of you as architects are still going to be meeting modernists, particularly the odd liturgist or director of religious education who might be sitting on a parish building committee and saying, why are you building, why are you trying to give me some historical style? That's all pre-Vatican II. That has nothing to do with us today. So I want to give you some, when they say to you, you're just trying to drag us back to the days before Vatican II. I'm trying to give you the ammunition for telling them, yes, I am. And that's what this is really about as architects, as Catholic architects. When the church calls for the building to be a sign and symbol of a heavenly thing, let's squeeze through here. I haven't been paying much attention to this part. Okay. Sign and symbol of heavenly thing. She's placing a great burden on the architects. All the more so since, over the course of the 20th century, we've really abandoned this language of sacred architecture and historical styles. It's very, very unhip or to appeal to historical styles today. Now, this is all the more interesting because over the course of the 20th century, the main force in shaping the minds of architects and liturgists and theologians has been through basically the liturgical movement over the 20th century. It's curious that the liturgical movement basically starts with the writings of Pope Pius X in his little encyclical, or his little, it's not an encyclical, it's just a motu proprio, a little personal statement on sacred music. Tra la sollicitudine. It's explicitly concerned with sacred music, but he begins with the importance of sacred architecture. And he says, among the cares of the pastoral office, a leading one, without question, is that of maintaining and promoting the decorum of the house of God, in which the august mysteries of religion are celebrated, and where Christian people assemble to receive the grace of the sacraments. Nothing, therefore, in the temple should be calculated to disturb or even merely to diminish the piety and devotion of the faithful. He goes on to say that the sanctity and dignity of the temple are there in order that the faithful might acquire the proper spirit of active participation. So whenever you hear this phrase by liturgists talking about, well, we need to get rid of columns, we need to have everyone wrapped around the altar, because that's what active participation is about, I'd suggest that you direct them back to the call of Pius X to have them be more concerned about the sanctity and the dignity of the temple. Now, within the liturgical movement, there were two kind of overarching themes. One of them being ressourcement, the return to the sources, particularly in the sense of recovering, going back to the source of Scripture and the early church fathers, the patristics, regarding things like the liturgical traditions, the symbols, theological understandings. The second one is aggiornamento, the updating of things, that things need to somehow speak to our time. So these two concepts, risorgimento, looking back at the past, aggiornamento, trying to keep up with the times, are sometimes put into tension with one another, but both of them in a particular way, I think, have contributed to the loss in general of this tradition that we have, both of the meaning of sacred architecture, but also the historical styles. So you see in the typical rhetoric of the mid-20th century church writers, liturgical writers, and so forth, you see this kind of sense that we need to build for modern man. And there's a whole rhetoric that says we need to construct to serve men of our age. Somehow the past is defunct. It's no longer vital. It no longer speaks to us. Churches that look like churches are just nostalgic. There's some kind of, in the psychological sense of nostalgia, that you're looking to the past, some golden age past that never really existed, but that's where you find your comfort, okay? For instance, Edward Mills, writing in The Modern Church, says, "If we do not build churches in keeping with the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist, we shall be admitting that religion no longer possesses the same vitality as our secular buildings." His book, of course, concerned topics such as efficient planning, technology, cost abatement, environmental considerations. It's worth mentioning that a few years before he wrote the book, The Modern Church, he wrote the book, The Modern Factory, with the same rationalistic concerns for efficient planning, technology, cost abatement, and environmental considerations. But we see something else going on in the mid-20th century writers, because one can't merely discard 2,000 years of historical architectural precedent and just create something anew. There has to be a paradigm shift. And in a sense, one can't reject the old paradigm without having a new paradigm to replace it. All the better if that new paradigm was to be the authentic paradigm, a recovery of what was lost. So within this rhetoric, we kind of see an embedded mythos, a myth of architecture, of liturgy, of the way the church has progressed over 2,000 years. By this accounting, only around the Edict of Constantine, 313, when the church was first legalized, did supposedly the church begin to formalize her liturgy, create hierarchical structures of the priesthood and the bishops and the pope and so forth, and all of the trappings of architecture, the formalistic liturgies, procession, hierarchical structures and so forth, were these elements taken from the pagan imperial court. And before that, somehow, Christians just kind of gathered together in little base communities and enjoyed one another's company in little house churches. Now, such a model became the model for contemporary worship in the 50s, particularly, as this domestic, residential-scaled architecture that discarded the past. And this was to be the model for liturgical reform. As Richard Vosko summarizes, the earliest understanding of a Christian church building implies that it is a meeting house, a place of camaraderie, education, and worship. In fact, the earliest Christian tradition held that the church did not build temples to honor God. That is what civic religion did. Well, this notion of the domestic house church, which was converted for Christian worship, kind of grew in the mid-century with the discovery of this little house church in Dura Europos, which is interesting because it's fairly late dated. It's the year 232 approximately, and it was clearly a residence that was converted into a church. That is indisputable. So this became the dominant model for liturgists to validate this, and we all know the scriptures, particularly the writings of Paul, where he talks about, the church that meets in the house of Priscilla and Aquila and so forth. I mean, there was this model of domesticity in the church before Constantine. The only problem with this is that of this idea of Christians up until 300 or so meeting in small churches, is that it's really not supported by any real evidence. Okay, I mean, there's a dearth of evidence, I should say, because the imperial persecutions pretty much leveled a lot of Christianity, and this happened over the course of years. The other thing was the relatively small scale of Christianity. Up until about the year 200, maybe 0.5% of the Roman Empire was Christian. That's a couple 100,000 people out of a population of like 60 million. So the fact that we have any evidence whatsoever of this very small group of Christians is kind of remarkable in itself. And Christianity basically grows over the 3rd century from about the year 200 to 300, and that's when actually we see the kind of the expansive rise of Christianity. 5 minutes? So what I want to do here is just talk a little bit about some of the paleographic evidence that we have that would contradict this idea of small Christian churches. We know from the Chronicles of Arbela, a 5th century manuscript, tells that the Bishop Isaac, living in about the year 130, 140, he had a large, well-ordered church which still exists today. Now that church doesn't exist today, but it did in the 5th century. The Chronicles of Edessa mention a Christian church which was destroyed around the year 201. Around the year 225 AD, Christians had acquired a piece of public property, and they were in dispute with some innkeepers about who gets to own this or who gets to build on it. And the emperor, Severus Alexander, determined it was better that a house be built to worship the gods than for the drinking and an eating house. Likewise, we see the pagan Porphyry in the middle of the 3rd century attacks the Christians who, imitating the erection of temples, build very large buildings into which they go and gather and pray. Lactantius talks about the church in Nicodemia as a lofty edifice. It was situated, he says, on rising ground within a view of the palace, and how the emperors Diocletian and Galerius could see it. And they were debating amongst themselves whether they should tear it down or burn it down. Finally, the Emperor Aurelian makes a passing reference to a Christian church, Christianorum Ecclesia, in contrast to his own religious temples, Templo Deorum Omnia, the temple of all gods. So I just submit that if the emperor of the Roman Empire knew a Christian church when he saw it, it was no small domestic building. So I basically want to suggest that this whole notion has been kind of misunderstood. And historically, or in terms of historiography and architecture, we see every age of Christianity from about the time of Eusebius, when we first read the accounts of the great building of Tyre, up to the present day, up to this 1950s, it's a series of deviations and missteps. So, for instance, the Roman Basilica is discarded by liturgical and architectural writers because of this sense that it's a misstep. It is taking aboard the trappings of the Roman Empire with its imperialistic aspirations, and it's a deviation from the gospel. Virtually every stage of Christian building that we all look for models, over the 20th century gets rejected by writers, by architectural critics, by architectural writers, by liturgists. The Romanesque is considered too long. It creates this very distant sense of God. The cathedral, the Gothic cathedral, is seen as as alienating for its monumentality. The Baroque comes in for particular censure. Father Boyer, God bless him, he thinks that the Baroque liturgy was embalmed and devoid of vitality. I honestly think they're just missing what's really going on here. And instead, we get this very, very kind of ideogrammic model of architecture from, for instance, Reinhold's, speaking of liturgical architecture. Typical language, conclusion. We see all these styles were children of their own day. None of their forms are ours. We have concrete and steel, wood compositions, brick, stone, glasses of all kind, plastic materials, reverse cycle heating and radiant heat. We can no longer identify with the minority called Christendom and split into schisms with the kingdom of God on earth. Our society is pluralistic, and we live in a secular atmosphere. Our architects must find as good an expression in language of form as our fathers did in theirs. We're out of time. Thank you. I would just want to conclude by suggesting that Eusebius is where we get this major body of thought about sacred architecture. But he is not making this up. A lot of architectural historians kind of point to Eusebius and his account of Tyre as being the innovation of this whole notion that the building somehow represents the kingdom of God, the heavenly Jerusalem, the tent of dwelling and so forth. Eusebius is working within an established architectural tradition that, in my estimation, goes back generations before, probably apostolically. That is the continuity and tradition that we are working in today. We can, I think, justly reject this past deviation since about the mid-20th century thinkers. We have absolute validity for reclaiming an architectural tradition which is of the body, the temple, and the city that expresses somehow mystically the body of Christ. Thank you for your time.
I've got the pleasure to introduce Thomas Gordon Smith, AIA. Mr. Smith is a practicing architect, author, and scholar. He holds a BA in art and a master's in architecture from UC Berkeley. He won the Rome Prize in Architecture and subsequently studied at the American Academy in Rome in 1980. He currently makes his home in South Bend and is a professor at the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture. And if I'm correct, he was instrumental in freeing the program from the engineering college and establishing it as its own independent school within the university. In the past, Mr. Smith held teaching positions at Yale, Southern California's Institute of Architecture, and UCLA. Mr. Smith has authored numerous articles on design in the classical tradition. He also has, to his credit, a growing list of ecclesiastical projects. His presentation will be on reanimation of classical and Romanesque paradigms in the new Catholic architecture. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much. I know some of these buildings have been talked about today earlier. I'm really pleased to be following Stephen and looking forward to this whole session, and was able to catch a few things this morning when I came in. I'm very happy to be here in Washington and at Catholic University and this wonderful conference. Thank you so much for making it so open and inviting so many different people. I want to pick up on Stephen's use of the word paradigm and model because the Greeks used the word paradigma as a word for a physical architectural model or a sculpture of a capital, similar to the one we saw on the previous slide here. So that this is a word that has, of course, great ancient, antique meaning. But I'm going to suggest that in the year 2000, that there were basically two very different paradigms. And one was what we see here in the Church of the Millennium, one of many churches built that year, but certainly this is the one by Richard Meyer that is the most clear and was the most celebrated. And the other, of course, its progenitor, the paradigm for Meyer, and in fact the paradigm for all of Meyer's buildings, I think, is Corbusier. There's no question in my mind formally that almost everything refers back to Corbusier. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm going to advocate the use of paradigms today, but in the sense of older architecture rather than that of a modernist master like Corbusier. But this was a product of basically the Vatican bureaucracy, and I owe some of these insights certainly to the previous speaker, who has done a lot of work on this issue. But there was a bureaucratic situation. There was a need, of course, at the year 2000 to follow up on the tremendous 50-year cycle of building a church for the Jubilee. But this was a one which, of course, was very much in concert with what Stephen was talking about just now, and is the official position still. The Venice Biennale in the summer will have a Vatican pavilion, and the same kind of mentality about architecture will be there, evident. Now, I want to talk about another paradigm, which is definitely alive and well by the time of 2000. And someone earlier had spoken about Robert Venturi and a number of other architects, I would say, of his generation, who really liberated us from feeling the constraint of following models and imitating architecture of the past. So in this case, just a few slides here of buildings you'll probably see this weekend, and have seen already, in which there's a vital group of architects and a sort of under-the-radar group of patrons who are specifically asking for and understand the meaning and the reason that they want to find an architect who will build for them within a language of architecture which is not only recognizable to the architects, but recognizable to the patrons themselves. They're doing this conscious seeking out. I was speaking to the new abbot of Clear Creek today, who was talking just of this, and that was one of the first things he said 10 years ago when I was able to begin to work with him and his community. Now, the image on the left is the image of Janus, the Roman god who had a head looking forward and one looking backward, and somehow the experiences of the present also were mixing up in that mind inside there. And this is the symbol for the American Academy in Rome, established in the 1890s as a symbol for the institution. The American Academy hasn't had in the last 20 years too many people who are interested in that old tradition and that old value on the advantage of looking backward and then mixing things of it as well as making them relevant for our time, is that common phrase. On the right is an inscription at Notre Dame of one of the extensions we made to the building, which quotes Vitruvius's famous statement in terms of the education of architects, in terms of needing to study to be able to develop manual practice, manual skill, and the intellect. And the combination of those two would form a balance. But there are so many things that he brought from Greek previous architects who had written that fortunately, since his treatises were saved during Romanesque times, we have, and it's been extremely valuable. For example, Palladio himself, as Duncan Stroik told me years ago, pointed out to me, the first words in the Quattro Libri are, I follow Vitruvius as master and guide. Now, this is obviously an architect who had tremendous development and many, many, many huge contributions, certainly the most influential in the English-speaking world, and even today, enjoying his work, is enjoying renewed avid interest and imitation by architects, especially in the English-speaking world again. But going back to Vitruvius himself, he is writing this book for the Emperor Augustus, and is creating a a lifeline that was necessary to reanimate architecture in a time of tremendous discord after the civil wars, and to bring things back together and bring discipline and professionalism back to the field, as well as a particular Greek aesthetic, which was very much inspired the development of Roman architecture. In 1980, when I returned from the American Academy, I had realized an objective during that year to begin to read kind of deeply Vitruvius, and wound up doing a book on Vitruvius, and then was able, when I came to Notre Dame, to build a house, a Vitruvian house, in which I was able to, or set myself to, imitating Vitruvius very literally. The Eustylos, or the well-columned house that's represented in this picture, the ideal proportions for Ionic architecture, is what I followed directly to the rule in terms of the portico of that building. And then apply other elements that he talks about, practical ones, such as the idea of using symmetria, as he called it, or proportional relationships. And in this case, because brick was available in a Roman-type foot, the adjacent pilasters were formed in brick, and the brick itself, the module of the brick, then established a module for the column base, which was made in southern Indiana to that particular type. So many aspects, and certainly aspects of at least the way I teach architecture at Notre Dame today, is predicated on using Vitruvius as a primer, something that some great information and still extremely valid aspects. The aspects of Vitruvius that he describes in the book one about the education and the methods and means of an architect are just practiced today as he did describe them at the time. And I used to say that the one characteristic, the decor of canon and custom, which means imitation of old things, to the point that you understand how to do them correctly so you don't look like an imbecile, like a lot of postmodern classicism does, intentionally or not, is one thing that was just exclusive still to the classical set. But now I'm becoming aware, watching periodically, looking at architectural record and so forth, that paradigmatic imitation of models and so forth, and developing them, such as many of the case study house revival buildings that we see, is shared by modernists and classicists, or people who are interested in ancient paradigms as well. The projects I'd like to show are ones which really I was able to apply this kind of understanding of professional practice and methods of thinking things through and solving problems from Vitruvius. Were not really specifically classical buildings in the sense of that portico of our house. They were two projects in which the client asked for Romanesque architecture. So the one here is the recently dedicated church for the priestly fraternity of St. Peter in Lincoln, Nebraska area. And this is a project which is for a new order established just over 20 years ago. And in both of these cases, one later for Benedictines and for the priestly fraternity, deeply, deeply paradigmatic reanimations of principles and methods and aspects of the extraordinary form of the liturgy itself, to say nothing of theology and even the ritual of consecration of this particular church, which come from antiquity. And at least 500 years to 1,500 years ago. So that this is a wonderful pairing as an architect to be able to work with a client or a group with whom one is in sync, but also who have the same aspirations to bring back to life the elements. Now, Vitruvius has a famous statement about the architect needing to juggle basically three areas: strength, function, and beauty. And I show this group in terms of strength to bring up yet another aspect which we all struggle with as architects. How do we build something that in this case is kind of a Romanesque church in this period of time, 2000 and more recently, and give it the solidity, the durability, so that it can be argued that it should be consecrated rather than blessed, and also that will create the sense of not a pastiche of architecture, but the authenticity of it. So this has to do with then building with materials, his word economia, that are of our time in the sense that they are used, and yet at the same time push oneself as an architect, but also the contractor, in terms of making those more and more authentic, more and more load-bearing, let's say, too. In terms of function, there are lots of aspects of that in a church. I'll just focus on that in this particular seminary setting. But in this case, there's a very particular liturgy. There is a new group here who are modeling their training for seminarians, of which there are 100 there right now. And it's based on certain monastic models, even though they are a secular group, a fraternity, not an order itself. The aspect of the basilical, which has been brought up as being focused, as certainly being focused on the tabernacle, on the altar itself. This, by the way, is a object of spolia, the spoils of a baldacchino, but nonetheless the focus of the building, both for lay people and the seminarians in seating, facing each other, is very aspect of the utility. Father Van Vliet, the tremendous client representing this project, was a person tremendously involved. In fact, he actually rebuilt by hand the baldacchino itself. So a very great example of the intellect and the manual skill coming together. Here on the right, too, is a wonderful aspect of the dedication and consecration of the building and the altars in terms of the local bishop, Bruskowitz, inscribing in the sand just in front of the altar the Greek and Latin alphabets, so that the recovery and the reuse of vitalization of old forms of dedication are very much a practice here. The work we see here, unfinished yet, a James Langley painting. The whole seminary is dedicated to Our Lady of Guadalupe, so this will be fleshed out pretty soon. And the painting we've seen earlier today of James the Triptych, now in New York. And then looking forward to the next project, some sculpture in process now of the capitals, which will be at the portal of this monastery, located near Tulsa, Oklahoma. A group of both American and French Benedictine monks who have come in the last 10 years to develop the monastery of the Annunciation. In this case, we have completed portions of construction, including the residential building, the Porter's Lodge, and then the crypt of the church. This summer, we will begin a partial portion, including the portal of the prime portal of the church itself. So this will be a very long-term project that I've been working on for 10 years and hope to be continuing with for many. So the portal here will be constructed, as well as a portion up to just about the top of its arch this summer. The buildings, again, show the function of the building, which is a enclosed monastery, so that the many problems of maintaining the privacy, as well as enabling the typical Benedictine hospitality for the building, could be balanced, and the materials and forms of construction are even a step ahead of what we were able to do at the seminary in terms of creating some load-bearing portions of the church structure in particular. I'd just like to look forward to the next generation. I'm thrilled that there are so many students from here at Catholic University, as well as some of our alumni at Notre Dame, and I'm sorry I don't recognize others who are here today who are still in the student mode and working toward, as well, the professional licensure and so forth. This is a tremendous time. It's a time of phenomenal recognition of just the motu proprio of Benedict XVI, what a change that's made in the use and the acceptance and the possibility of the old Latin rites. And I will end just with a quote of Cardinal de Noia, who came to the consecration and benediction of the church at Our Lady of Guadalupe Seminary, where he made a very strong and extremely important point. And it was not just for the members who were there in the congregation that day, but for literally the thousands who were watching on EWTN, that this is not a matter of schism. This is a matter of the richness, the variety of our liturgy and of our way of living the Catholic faith. And I think that too, in terms of looking at the potential of paradigms in ancient architecture and of the last 2,000 years at least, it's a time of tremendous opportunity and growth in a similar positive way. Thank you very much.
I would next like to introduce Mr. Thomas Stroka. Mr. Stroka makes his home in Michigan City, Indiana. He's currently an architectural designer working with Duncan Stroik. Mr. Stroka holds a Bachelor of Science in Architecture from the University of Illinois and a Master of Architecture from the University of Notre Dame. He will present on the subject of Catholic architecture calls for a common language, Alberti, and the ornament of sacred buildings. Mr. Stroka.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate today. When evaluating architectural language for a church building, we commonly look to the association of the architecture with a particular age rather than develop a coherent order and graceful details for the building. Our church, built for a patron today with pointed arches, is meant to evoke the sentiments of Gothic cathedrals and the piety associated with the Middle Ages, but is not necessarily a careful study of proportions and consistent architectural details. Church architecture demands a relationship between structural elements, an appropriate hierarchy of spaces, and generous ornament. Despite the 20th century overhaul of traditional church forms and artistic symbols, people today continue to prefer traditional architecture and take pleasure in the beauty of handcrafted detail and the meaning embedded in ornament. In order for church architects to build with an ordered architectural language, the design must be rooted in the tradition of ornament, inherited from our predecessors, rather than in an interest in innovation for innovation's sake. We will study three threads in the 15th century treatise Decim Libri de Re Edificatoria by Leon Battista Alberti, a Renaissance humanist who called for a common architectural language which distinguishes public, private, sacred, and profane buildings. First, we will look at the principles of the treatise and the specific points in his 7th book regarding sacred buildings. Then we will study the definitions of beauty and the place of ornament in architecture. Finally, we will discuss the cause of beauty in architectural design according to Alberti. Why does De Re Edificatoria have relevance today for architects? It is because this text was the first to elevate building practice to the art of building since antiquity. To reanimate architecture in a digital age, it must be re-recognized for its beauty more than its utility. A new renaissance in sacred architecture, therefore, calls for deeper study of the principles of the art of building. Leon Battista Alberti was born in 1404 and raised in Genoa. He excelled in Latin and entered the University of Padua to study canon and civil law. He was ordained a priest and wrote a treatise on painting, sculpture, and on the family. His work on the theory of architecture, De Re Edificatoria, was finished in the middle of the 15th century. Alberti presented a version of the treatise to Pope Nicholas V, to whom he served as architectural consultant in the years following the 1450 Jubilee. It was widely circulated in Italy only when the Renaissance was in full bloom 1 century later. The first Italian translation was not available until 1546, and illustrations accompanied the text only in 1550. Alberti addresses both architects and their patrons in the treatise, and considers the elements of architecture and beauty in 10 books, in imitation of De Architectura by the Roman architect Vitruvius. Alberti builds upon Vitruvius's imitation of the laws of nature in architecture with a Christian worldview, and suggests that the architect's use of his intellect to design beautiful buildings reflects God's creative process. As he accomplished for the other arts in his previous works, Alberti provides a foundation, this time for the architect, to stimulate delight and transform the civic realm through the addition of beautiful architecture. In the 7th book, entitled Ornament to Sacred Buildings, Alberti addresses the practical demands of church architecture and the poetic significance of ornament. Ultimately, Alberti argues for the importance of beauty for the life of the city and suggests that architecture is guided by nature, grounded in the congenitas, or congruity, between the human person and the Creator. It is this congenitas which informs a common language of architecture for every age, 15th century or 21st. The 10 books have an overarching order outlined by the author in the prologue. First, the definition of architecture and its parts. Second, the division between different building types. Third, the discussion of the causes and effects of beauty. Book 7 of De Re Edificatoria is entitled Ornament to Sacred Buildings. In this book, Alberti addresses the specific demands of sacred buildings, which he divides into the temple and basilica types, and calls for a common language in a time of particular confusion. Though he writes about church architecture using the pagan Latin terms for temple and the plural gods, he intends to fuse the architectural authority of the pagan temple with the supernatural order of the Catholic liturgy. The temple could be reinterpreted as a Christian shrine or centralized church, while the basilica serves as a traditional and more common longitudinal or cruciform church. The basilican form is noted for its focal point at the altar on one end, the space for the choir, and the generous nave and porticos in which the congregation may gather. Alberti writes that the basilica should imitate much of the ornament in temples, but will serve a different purpose. Specifically, the basilica hosts a rampaging crowd of litigants and should therefore have clear aisles and plenty of light. The church is both God's dwelling place in the form of the Blessed Sacrament and is also the place for the worship of God in the Holy Liturgy. Alberti writes, "No aspect of building requires more ingenuity, care, industry, and diligence than the establishment and ornament of the temple." What are some of the specific recommendations by Alberti on sacred buildings from which we can learn today? First, the church should be in a bustling location in the city and visible from surrounding streets. Ideally, the church facade faces a forecourt or large square and is prominent among the other buildings, but in close proximity to the population. It is the most important building in the city, and its location should nurture the frequent piety of the citizenry rather than serve as a destination church once a week. An attractive church in the heart of a neighborhood can serve as the nucleus of community life. Of course, architects need to collaborate with urban planners and zoning officials to make this type of parish church a reality. Second, the church will better inspire souls if it is elevated above the ground rather than submerged or low-lying in the city. The whole temple should be raised above the level of the city. This will give it a greater air of dignity. In fact, Alberti studies ancient precedent and concludes that the best architects derive the height of the temple's base as 1/6 the width of the facade. The base of the church sets it apart from the commerce and traffic at grade and prepares the individual for the mystery of the liturgy with a procession up a noble staircase. Third, the church should be of a more modest size, only so large as the city requires, so that its surfaces can be ornamented appropriately. Alberti recommends generous decoration of the church and states that ornament is never completed. Unfortunately, we tend to build mammoth churches, which are expensive enough just to a roof, let alone adorn. Fourth, Alberti provides recommendations for finishing the surfaces of the church. He suggests decorating the brick walls with marble or glass, either paneled or as mosaic, while the exterior can be finished in stucco. The interior decoration can categorize and encourage the faithful to live virtuous lives. Alberti mentions the posting of maxims for the moral instruction of the faithful. More commonly in our churches today, the side walls and windows may depict the life of the patron saint or events from the life of Christ, while the sanctuary portrays the heavenly banquet. Fifth, Alberti writes that the floor should have a paving pattern in order to stimulate the mind with geometric lines. Sixth, in regard to the design of side chapels, they can be open to the nave or separated by a pair of columns or completely closed off from the nave. Seventh, Alberti makes specific references to windows in a temple, that they should be modest in size and be located above the congregation so that the only view is toward the sky. The distractions of the street or garden seen at the eye level will divert the minds of the worshipers from the liturgy. Many churches today bring an abundance of light into the space, which can reduce the austerity of the church, especially for the purpose of private devotion. Alberti suggests that some darkness creates a sense of mystery and encourages veneration by the people. Eighth, Alberti gives exhaustive recommendations for the entrance to the temple, modeled on ancient precedent. He delineates the differences between the Dorians, Ionians, and Corinthians after explaining their acceptance of a common architectural language. From the observation of architectural practice in antiquity, he discovers consistency in ornament. He says, all the best architects would make the jambs 1/14 narrower at the top than at the bottom. The lintel and the top of the jambs would be the same thickness, and their ornament would share the same profile. Alberti suggests building the temple doors of bronze for greater durability. For a basilica church, the doors should be of cedar or cypress, but with bronze knobs. These specifics serve as reminders of the importance of durability for the entrance and the entire church building. Ninth, according to Alberti, the altar for sacrifice should be higher than everything else, since it is the epicenter of worship. The sacrificial altar is to be set up so as to give it the greatest dignity. The ideal position, surely, is before the tribunal, he writes. The holy sacrifice calls for a noble position with all the other elements in the church building ordered to it. The 15th century, leading up to the Council of Trent in the 16th century, saw a wide variety of church arrangements which were considered disorienting by Alberti. The high altar in the apse of the church was overwhelmed by side aisles full of altars and devotional shrines. Alberti believes it necessary for the architecture, not necessarily the pews, to focus attention on the main altar to preserve the dignity of the holy sacrifice, which had become confused by the crowding of other elements in the church. 10th, the architect should incorporate the design of the liturgical elements into the church building. Alberti writes that the candelabrum, for example, should be wider at the base than the top, and divides the whole piece into 7 parts, which are subsequently proportioned. The ornament inside the churches and the liturgical elements are part of the overall order of the architectural language. Each of these principles can help architects invoke the living tradition of sacred architecture in the design of new churches. The second important thrust of Alberti's De Re Edificatoria is his definition of beauty in architecture and the means to accomplish it through the use of ornament. At the beginning of Book 6, Alberti refers to the 3 principles of architecture from Vitruvius: Firmitas, Utilitas, and Venustas. But it is to Venustas that Alberti pays attention in the second half of the treatise. He defines beauty and its place in the art of building, specifically with the use of proportion, ornament, and the appropriate positioning of the building elements. He writes, beauty is that reasoned harmony of all the parts within a body so that nothing may be added, taken away, or altered but for the worse. It is a great and holy matter. Rarely is beauty to be found, even in nature itself. Ornament amplifies the beautiful nature of a building or makes an unpleasant building more bearable. Beauty and ornament are not synonymous, but reinforce one another. Ornament is a form of auxiliary light and complement to beauty, he writes. Architectural language and its ornament contain a narrative of human habits and gestures that relate a building to the broader architectural tradition. Alberti appeals to this narrative in his description of classical forms by infusing a Christian conception of the created world. Beauty and ornament can be found together through the art of building and applied to sacred architecture through the implementation of traditional building principles. First, architects can learn from the existing repertoire of church buildings. Many before us have already resolved design problems that we will encounter. Alberti suggests that architects learn from successful buildings and should sketch details to keep a record. He writes, wherever there is a work that has received general approval, you should inspect it with great care, record it in drawing, note its numbers, and construct models and examples of it. However, architects are not called to slavishly copy the most beautiful works of architecture. In the first book, Alberti writes, "There is no reason why we should follow famous architects in our work, as though legally obliged, but rather, inspired by their example, we should strive to produce our own inventions, to rival, or if possible, to surpass the glory of theirs." The second consideration for the application of ornament for a sacred building is architectural convention. Conventions have defined the appropriate use of ornament and even the specific application of the classical orders. The ornament employed in a building articulates its place in the city, or decorum, and the church building has the highest position among all the public buildings. We therefore distinguished the various types of buildings and noted the importance of the connection of their lines and their relationship to each other as the principal sources of beauty. Alberti argues that ornament helps define a church building as sacred. He writes, "With sacred works, especially public ones, every art and industry must be employed to render them as ornate as possible." Third, ornament is conceived as integral to the structure of the building and cannot be removed. In the whole art of building, the column is the principal ornament without any doubt. It may be set in combination to adorn a portico, wall, or other form of opening, nor is it unbecoming when standing alone. The column is considered by Alberti both structural and decorative, and is inherited from use in Greek and Roman precedent. The three principal orders are related to three human measures. Fuller, more practical, and enduring is the Doric. Slender and full of charm is the Corinthian, and the one that lay in between is the Ionic. Alberti writes that the ancients invented these ornaments for the body of the building as a whole, and is the first to indicate the hierarchy of the orders within the design of a building. He writes, "Make the ornament to the window openings Corinthian, to the main entrance Ionic, and to the doors of the dining rooms, chambers, and so on, Doric." Architects from the Renaissance through today have continued to elaborate the role of the orders in the ornament of buildings. Fourth, the meaning of classical ornament found in antiquity is incorporated into the narrative of Christian sacred architecture. The anthropomorphic analogy found in Vitruvius's text is reintroduced by Alberti with specific terms derived from the human body, which has been elevated by the incarnation. He writes, "When the ancients considered man's body, they decided to make columns after its image." Alberti was familiar with the medieval encyclopedic texts which brought the elements of architecture to life through the use of terms of the human body. He calls the top of the column the caput, or head, and the bottom of the column the planta, or foot. He includes a reference to the Ark of Noah in Scripture, which was built based on the human figure. Alberti praises God's creation for its coherence and completeness, and indicates that architects should design buildings that imitate that creation. He writes, "Nature was so thorough in forming the bodies of animals that she left no bone separate or disjointed from the rest. Likewise, we should link the bones and bind them fast with muscles and ligaments, so that their frame and structure is complete and rigid enough to ensure that its fabric will stand on its own, even if all else is removed." Finally, the third thread we will examine in the treatise is the cause of beauty in architecture. After defining beauty, Alberti breaks up its cause into four interrelated categories. He writes, "We may conclude beauty to be such a consent and agreement of the parts of a whole in which it is found as to number, finishing, and collocation, as congruity, that is to say, the principal law of nature requires. Therefore, the beauty of architecture is dictated by the laws of nature, especially in the form of number, or numerus, finishing, or finitio, collocation, or collocatio, which together result in a harmony, or concinitas. In judging numerus, or a number in a building, the architect observes what happens in nature and consults the philosophers. In the treatise, Alberti reflects on the even number of feet of all the animals in God's creation and the implication in determining the even number of columns in ancient buildings. Though there is a large variety of species, some more celebrated than others, they all abide by the law of an even number of legs. In the same way, beautiful architecture has an even number of supports and an odd number of openings or doorways. Numbers can be celebrated in architecture, and they can have deep meaning for churches. Of the three causes of beauty, numerus is the most perceptible in ordering the building. In referring to the second, finitio, or finishing, Alberti means the relationship between the length, breadth, and height of the lines of the materials. It determines proportions in the building formed by the architect. He argues that certain proportions in a building are inherently more attractive to the beholder. This requires the work of the craftsman to apply his skills to the physical material, the amassing, adding, diminishing, chipping, polishing, and the like, which make the work delicate. Finitio is a call for proportionality in the plan of the building, such as the medieval methods ad quadratum and ad triangulum, which are then carried up in 3 dimensions by the architect. Alberti also argues that harmonic proportions in architecture are related to the harmony of music. Architects employ these numbers to lay out dimensions in plan and to develop harmonious heights of rooms. Through the use of these and other types of proportioning, the architect can relate each part of the building to the whole. Collocatio, or composition, is the right arrangement of the different members of the building, both small and large. Take great care to ensure that even the minutest elements are so arranged in their level, alignment, number, shape, and appearance that right matches left, top matches bottom, adjacent matches adjacent, and equal matches equal, and that they are an ornament to that body of which they are a part. Collocatio relies more on the natural abilities of man to put things together. The final category for beauty in a building by Alberti is the most significant, congenitas, or congruity, which encompasses the previous 3, numerus, finitio, collocatio. Ultimately, Alberti applies the term congenitas to the harmony of the individual parts within the whole building, a harmony that imitates the perfection embodied by nature. When Alberti uses the term nature, he refers to the underlying order founded by God, the Creator. Congenitas in architecture is therefore the design of buildings which resemble the beauty composed by the great artist himself. Man has been given an intellect to examine nature and transfer these observations into the language of architecture. Congenitas is the main object of the art of building and the source of her dignity, charm, and worth. The architect fulfills his social responsibility by providing congenitas, the integration of beautiful proportion and natural material found in nature, into the building. Men can be moved by beauty, both in churches and in other noble buildings, to live virtuous lives. In conclusion, to build successful church buildings, we can emulate the principles set forth by Alberti, which are rooted in the architecture inherited by the Christian church from antiquity. In Decem Libre de Re Edificatoria, we are reminded of architecture's role in defining a building as sacred, of the place of ornament in architectural design, and of the cause of beauty in architecture. With ordered architectural language, our churches can be noble houses of God and better inspire the faithful to live virtuous Christian lives. Thank you.
The last speaker is Mr. David Kuhlman, AIA. Mr. Kuhlman makes his home in Park Ridge, Illinois. He's a practicing architect and a principal with the firm of Jaeger, Nicola and Associates. He has also worked in the past for firms in Chicago as well as here in Washington, D.C. He holds a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture and has several publications to his credit. Mr. Kuhlman will present a case for diversity in the design of Catholic churches. Mr. Kuhlman.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with you, but also especially to speak with Thomas Gordon Smith, who joined the Notre Dame program when I was a student there. I was actually studying in Rome that year, our 3rd year at Notre Dame, and he took over the program while I was there and has been very influential in my development and in my respect for the traditions of architecture. But also Stephen Schlater, whose book was very influential when I read it in the mid-90s as I started to get into religious architecture and read his Architecture and Communion, which has also been influential and instrumental in my development, especially when I started practicing religious architecture in the late 90s. So, according to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, sacred art achieves beauty when its form evokes and glorifies the transcendent mystery of God. All architects, artists, and musicians serving the church are called to manifest this transcendent beauty of God in their creative work. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, beauty requires radiance, harmony, and wholeness, and the chief requirement is radiance. And the radiance of beauty is the splendor of form. when the essence of a thing shines clearly through its outward appearance. Since the essence of every Catholic church is to reflect the beauty of God in the sacred liturgy, to achieve beauty, their designs must manifest the heavenly liturgy, which is celebrated in the heavenly Jerusalem. But there is a diverse range of cultures within the Catholic Church, with diverse backgrounds, liturgies, and approaches to manifesting God's beauty. Our architecture firm specializes in exclusively serving churches, and our recent work is a reflection of this diverse search for beauty within the Catholic population. And I propose that no single architectural style can be identified as the ideal, rather that the beauty and perfection of the church merge from a diverse array of designs for Catholic churches. The Darien Center is a new 2-story residence for male members of the Opus Dei, which will serve as a center of spiritual formation for both members and non-members. Reverence for the Holy Eucharist is central to the identity of Opus Dei and was a guiding principle in the design of this 50-seat oratory, a place of prayer within the residence where Mass will be celebrated daily, Eucharistic exposition will take place weekly, and evenings of reflection will occur monthly. With the 2-story volume of the space provided in the residence for the oratory, a classical design approach provided a rational means of creating a strong sense of formality, intimacy, and harmony in an otherwise awkwardly proportioned space. And I want to note that the design was for the entire building was done by another architect, so we were left with a volume of a space that was predetermined. So we had to work within that volume, and the classical approach allowed us to reduce the scale and give it a human scale. Reflecting the identity of the users, the Doric order was implemented because of its simple elegance and masculinity. Pilasters divide the nave into 4 bays and support a continuous entablature that provides a single spring line for the vaulted ceiling and a means for concealing mechanical diffusers and cove lighting. Arched niches within each bay contain sacred images and the Stations of the Cross. The vault over the nave terminates above the sanctuary, where a central arch and vaulted apse, framed by pilasters and projecting Solomonic columns, accentuate the hierarchy of the sanctuary. Engaged Solomonic columns support a triumphal arch and a frame of marble reredos with a replica of Murillo's Holy Family, which, along with the marble altar design, highlight the Tempiotto-inspired tabernacle with its Solomonic columns and gold dome, all professing the Eucharist as the source and summit of the Christian life. The St. Jose Maria Chapel was designed for the Northridge Preparatory School, a Catholic school for boys grades 6 through 12, which is also operated by members of the Opus Dei. Similar to the Darien Center, beauty and an emphasis on the Holy Eucharist were primary goals. But with a limited budget, limited to space of 2 former science classrooms and only 9'6" feet of clearance, and finally a consideration of the younger culture of the primary users, a simpler and more contemporary design aesthetic was implemented. A shallow vaulted ceiling and continuous horizontal reveals in the walls and doors of the chapel direct the eye to the tabernacle and its Raphael Madonna backdrop. The suspended wood slat canopy accentuates the main altar under the vault while pointing toward the tabernacle. The design of the altar and pedestal for the tabernacle again features Solomonic columns, but a contemporary derivation in this instance with the use of spiraling reveals in the wood columns. A decorative iron gate visually frames the apse and provides required security for the tabernacle for after hours when the school is closed. And a suspended wood corona above the tabernacle extends the church's long-standing tradition of accenting the Blessed Sacrament with a canopy or baldacchino. Both of the chapels strive to achieve beauty and to manifest the centrality of the Eucharist, but each does so with a different aesthetic approach, reflecting the culture of each of the communities being served. The Martoma Shlia Cathedral was designed for the recently established Syro-Malabar Catholic Diocese in Chicago, for the 100,000 members of the Catholic community living in North America. Aside from incorporating traditional liturgical elements and arrangements that reflect their particular liturgy, the community wanted a design that represented their origins in India, while also reflecting the Western identity of the new diocese and their communion with the Roman Catholic Church. The resulting design is therefore a somewhat eclectic building, contemporary in some respects and traditional in others. The church features a large octagonal pitched roof that culminates in a bell-shaped dome centered over the sanctuary, which is reminiscent of the church's architecture in India. Octagonal corner bays express the presence of the daily chapel and Eucharistic chapel on the interior and are accentuated by traditional cupolas and smaller versions of the same bell-shaped dome. The Baroque-inspired main entrance portico features triumphal brick arches, stone symbols of the Catholic faith, and a vaulted niche housing a statue of Jesus the Good Shepherd, symbolizing Jesus' love for each person and the local bishop's role as shepherd of this particular diocese. The interior of the cathedral reflects the liturgical identity of the Syro-Malabar Church, with a central bema where the gospel is proclaimed in front of the altar, and a suspended sanctuary veil, which recalls the veil in the Jewish tradition, separating the Holy of Holies, in this case the Eucharist, from the nave. The veil is theatrically closed at the preparation of the Eucharistic liturgy and open a few minutes later when the liturgy begins, heightening the sense of the sacred event. While at this time the interior is primarily drywall box has been mentioned before, this is a product of the limited budget for a project, and their intent is to ultimately embellish these walls with colorful stenciling and religious imagery. So hopefully that will happen in the near future. Focusing on the sanctuary, the tabernacle is enclosed with the traditional baldacchino, featuring Corinthian corner columns supporting angels, and a triumphal arch with a gold version of the same bell-shaped dome once again. Additional cultural expressions of beauty include their use of ribbon lights on the exterior, which was a surprise to me, and I didn't know that was going to happen until the night of the dedication. So that was a complete surprise, but it speaks directly of their culture. Colorful stained glass windows with images of the saints that are popular in the Syro-Malabar Church, and even on the interior, rotating color LED lighting. While some of the features of the cathedral may appear foreign to most of us, including myself, they are part of the Syro-Malabar Church's culture and represent their approach to achieving beauty. The Ascension of Our Lord Church represents a Byzantine Rite church. While this is for our Greek Orthodox community, their liturgical and stylistic approaches to achieving beauty are very similar to those of a Byzantine Catholic community, where the goal is creating heaven on earth. Traditional Byzantine churches best captured the essence of this desire, and the committee provided these precedents for the design process. The design began with the dome, the most important element in a Byzantine church, and traditional geometric relationships were used to design the dome and its relationship to the rest of the church. This preliminary massing section shows how the interior of the church will feature vaulted ceilings that will serve as a canvas for traditional Byzantine icons to create the sense of heaven on earth. These vaults are also represented in the exterior by arches set within the field of the exterior walls. The bottom images are from another Byzantine church which we designed, but provide examples of types of icons that will embellish the vaulted ceilings at Ascension. They also show another distinguishing element in Byzantine churches, the iconostasis, which separates the nave from the sanctuary. Similar to the Syro-Malabar veil, the iconostasis recalls the sanctuary veil in the Jewish tradition, separating the Holy of Holies from the nave of the church. The Arch of Triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the International Shrine of the Holy Innocents represents an unprecedented attempt to achieve what Pope John Paul called the new epiphany of beauty. Serving as a global call to conversion and repentance, the arch will continue to the new springtime of the church hailed by Pope John Paul, while symbolizing the entry of the church and the world into a new period of history. Arches have been used throughout history commemorating military triumphs and on a larger scale in St. Louis to celebrate America's westward expansion. So it's necessary and inevitable that the grandest triumphal arch ever constructed be built to commemorate the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, which is also the triumph of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Measuring 700 feet in height, 7 being the mystical number of perfection, the Arch of Triumph will be a world-class shrine, visited by millions of Christian pilgrims and tourists annually from around the world, and it will replace the St. Louis Arch as the world's tallest monument. The current design strives to achieve beauty by embracing modern design and technology, giving them a sacred meaning and marrying them with sacred form and imagery. Attempts to achieve beauty through the splendor of the form include the following: the use of the golden section to proportion the height and width of the arch, an arch form that is feminine in appearance while resembling in an understated way the letter M for Mary. A crown at the top of the arch, which will contain an observation deck and a chapel of triumph under the dome, that recalls the golden crown with the 12 stars of the woman clothed with the sun from the book of Revelations. And the embellishment of the exterior with recognizable Catholic symbols, including the Sacred Heart of Jesus at the intersection of the elevator shaft under the arch. And traditional design elements such as the large semi-enclosed forecourt that also recalls St. Peter's Square. While also featuring Doric column groupings with entablatures featuring engraved titles of Mary, traditional stone balustrades, and traditional statues of the Holy Family. Traditional designs of the interior and of the Holy Innocent Shrine and the Chapel of Triumph, and large replicas of traditional paintings will further reflect the respect for the artistic heritage of the Church. The search for beauty continues to develop and evolve on this project as we strive to convey the essence of the profound vision for this Arch of Triumph. Depending on the cultural identity and site and budgetary constraints and specific vision of each Catholic community serving to build or renovate a Catholic church, the quest for achieving transcendent beauty should be paramount and should reflect a theological aesthetic, a true understanding and respect for the Church's teaching on beauty and for the historic patrimony of its church architecture, while manifesting a sense of the heavenly banquet and God's supersubstantial beauty. But no architectural style has a monopoly on such beauty. As demonstrated, each Catholic community and each Catholic church project is unique. There are a variety of stylistic approaches that can be used to create churches that are truly beautiful, and in some cases, a contemporary design approach rooted in a Catholic understanding of beauty is the most appropriate option. But these are issues which each community and each church architect needs to discern so that the most appropriate approach is taken to achieve transcendent beauty. For as Pope John Paul stated, beauty is a key to mystery and a call to transcendence. It is an invitation to savor life and to dream of the future. And it stirs that hidden nostalgia for God, which a lover of beauty, like St. Augustine, could express in incomparable terms. Late have I loved you, beauty so new, so old, late have I loved you. Thank you.
I would invite all the speakers to join us as we have earlier in the day. Question?
Just to follow up on that, it seems to me if you look for some sort of essential language, something that is beyond style, you wind up with some sort of architectural Esperanto. You're just sort of a dead end. Something that really says nothing to anybody. It seems to me that in the particular are the generals, not somehow in some essence there's a particular. So I think style is critical. I mean, I don't think you should transcend it, or actually you really can. You just wind up with nothing.
That would be a whole different lecture, but I appreciate what you're saying. For me, there's a specific reason that these three metaphors, the body, the temple, and the city, occur in Scripture to explain the ecclesia, because they all do refer to parts of the whole. They all refer to specific location and meaning. There's a body of form attached to these things. The body is really the central metaphor here. It has linearity, it has symmetry, it has parts to the whole relationship. There's a metaphoric language to the body. By extension, I think dwelling and city, community, all these things are derived, but the primary symbol is always the human body, and that is the universal thing that we all share as human beings, which I think is why the metaphor of the body is really a dominant thing, not just in Christian architecture, but really you see the same thing in Indian architecture, in Islamic architecture, in Jewish architecture, because it's a universal thing that the sacramental system is built upon. The sacramental system is built upon nature, grace perfecting nature. So we get back to nature to understand that the prime experience of nature is to have a human body. And so that's the way we avoid syncretism, or avoid kind of just meaninglessness. It's to have a specific bell tower, a specific altar, a specific apse, a specific, side chapels. There's a language of form in architecture that helps us understand by analogy the body.
Unfortunately just to add to that, unfortunately for architects, we do have existing buildings, the repertoire. David mentioned in some of his projects, the client had an image in mind. There are churches that we've been to. All the ornament that we see in Gothic churches of Europe and classical churches of Italy have that body in mind, and that they have interpreted it over the ages. And so to ignore that, I think, would just be to burn the bibliography of our sacred buildings. So it's still continuing, and that's how we design, by looking at existing churches. So.
We're going to take one more question because I'm told the next speaker will be here shortly.
I'd like to direct this question to Professor Smith. We're sort of coming out of a generation or two of sacred architecture produced in the wake of Vatican II, where for many Catholics, the dictum pronounced by Andre Duani is clearly relevant. We've got 3,000 great modernist buildings. That's wonderful. The problem is we've got 30 million